Okay guys, so we're set up here in Visual Studio 2015 and we're going to see how we can get started creating an ASP.NET 5 MVC6 AngularJS project. So to get things off, I'm going to go to the File menu and I would like a new project. When the new project window pops up, I'm going to navigate to my template section, the Visual C# subsection, and then even further my web section. I'm going to select an ASP.NET web application, and I'm going to set a name and a location that suits my purposes. So I'm going to be calling my quotes app. You can call yours whatever you need to. You're then going to click the OK button. And in the new ASP.NET project window, you're going to scroll and find the ASP.NET 5 preview templates, and we're going to go with an empty application. I'm going to uncheck host in the cloud for now, and then go ahead and click OK. So Visual Studio is going to do its thing, and it's going to set up this project for you. Once it's all set up, I'm going to draw your attention to the Solution Explorer. You can see our project structure is broken into two main folders here, Solution Items and Source. And Source is where all of our app code is going to be. Within this source folder is a special folder here, www root, which is a folder that's going to hold all of our live web files. So any HTML, our eventual Angular app.js, any other minified scripts, image assets, or things like that that are going to be served up on the live site go in here, but all of our source code, the code that actually runs this ASP.NET 5 MVC6 Angular application, none of that is ever going to go in the www root folder. Now, starting off in an empty ASP.NET 5 application, I'm going to be adding a scripts folder. This is going to hold all of our script files. So what I'm going to do to create this is right-click on my project, my quotes app, and I'm going to add a new folder. And as we mentioned, I'm going to give this a name of scripts. Eventually, we want to have Grunt help us watch this folder and combine and minify all of the scripts in it before moving that result over to our live www root folder. Now, to install Grunt, we're going to be using the built-in support for the npm package manager that ASP.NET 5 brings. That's in addition to support for the Bower package manager, as well as NuGet package manager, which was always supported in earlier versions. So to get started using the npm package manager, I'm going to right click on my project. And again, I want to add, this time I'm going to add a new item. And in the add new item window, I'm going to go and select client side. And I'm going to scroll here until I see an npm configuration file option. Package.json is an appropriate name. So I'm going to go ahead and add that. And once it's set up, you can see where that actually shows up in my Solution Explorer, package.json, and in fact, it's been opened for us here as well. Now, this package.json file allows me to specify modules that I'd like to use. And so what we're going to be looking for here is the Grunt module and as well two Grunt plugin modules. And those are Grunt Contrib Uglify and Contrib Watch. So once I paste this in, you can see where I'm attempting to get Grunt version 0.4.5. I'm going after Grunt Contrib Uglify version 0.9.2 and Grunt Contrib Watch version 0.6.1. You're obviously going to try to get the latest version at the time of creating your project. Also, I'm installing Bower here, and that's going to be version 1.5.2. Any other dependencies that you think you're going to need, you can go ahead and add them as well. So once I save this file now, what's going to happen is in my Solution Explorer, I'm actually going to get this dependencies section being updated, and you can see I now have an npm folder. Visual Studio is actually going to try to automatically install these dependencies, these modules for me. And when it's done, they should all be available for me to see in my NPM folder. So now you can see Bower, Grunt, Uglify, and Watch all set up and ready to go. Now, if for some reason you do need to get these packages manually, that's a simple matter of right-clicking on the NPM folder and using the Restore Packages option. That again attempts to go and download and update the packages. Now we're set up in this project and we're starting off with our grunt module as well as our contrib uglify and contrib watch plugins already installed via npm. With these in place, the next thing I need to do is actually configure Grunt. I can do that by using a Grunt configuration file, and I can create one of those by right-clicking on my project, going to Add New Item, and selecting Grunt configuration file from the client side section. Now I'm going to leave the name as grunt.js and add that file. And immediately you'll see where it shows up in my Solution Explorer, and we're looking at this JavaScript file here on the left. You can see where this module is going to only be exporting one function, and that function is actually going to have access to the Grunt object. So within this function, the first thing I want to do is load my plugins. So I'm going to use the Grunt load npm tasks method to load both my Uglify and Watch plugins, which again we installed earlier using npm. The next step I need to take is I need to configure the plugins, and I can do that in this config method that was provided for me. So I'm going to paste in my configuration here, and you can see we're going to be configuring separately our Uglify plugin and then our Watch plugin. For the Uglify plugin, what we're saying here is we want Grunt to help us take all of the JavaScript files in our scripts folder, and specifically we're talking about app.js, which we have not yet created, and any other JavaScript files in the scripts folder or any subfolders. And we want those to be minified into another file here, app.js, that's going to be in our www root folder. Now, our second configuration here is just going to set things up in such a way that we're going to watch our scripts folder, and anytime there is a change to any JavaScript files in that folder, we're going to automatically run our Uglify, ensuring that we always have the latest version of our scripts in app.js in our web root folder. So now the last thing I want to do in this grunt configuration file is go ahead and register my tasks for running. So I'm going to use the register task function for that. And you can see where I'm associating a default task with my Uglify and Watch setups. So that's it for the configuration. Now, if I go ahead and save this, we should be able to actually run this file. So to do that, I'm going to navigate to the View menu, Other Windows, and I'm going to select the Task Runner Explorer. That's going to show up at the bottom, and I'm going to actually need to refresh it to see my saved tasks. And there you can see our default task. So to get that running, all I have to do is right click and select run. Now you can see the output, and right now the result is that nothing has been written to our www root app.js, and we expect that because we don't have any scripts in our script files to minify and then create that app.js out of. But now we can be sure that Grunt has been installed, has been configured, and is now watching that scripts folder for us. Our starting point is that we have an empty ASP.NET 5 application where we have downloaded and installed Grunt via npm, and also configured a few tasks to make sure all of our scripts are minified and placed in our www root folder. What we want to do now is enable MVC 6 for our application, and we're going to be doing that in our project.json file. I can find this project.json file in my Solution Explorer. So if I were to double click to open that up, you can see what that looks like. So this project.json file is actually used by the NuGet package manager to help manage dependencies. You can see in the dependencies section, right now we have two dependencies, ASP.NET server.iis and also a web listener, and we're going to be adding a third here, which as you can guess is going to be MVC6. So to get that going, I'm going to add one more line here, and that's going to be Microsoft.asp.NET. You can see I'm getting code hinting, and I'd like to go with MVC here. And at the time of me creating this demo, the latest version is 6.0.0 beta 5. You're obviously going to go with the latest version that makes sense for you when you create your applications. So what we want to do now is save our project.json file, and we want to move on here and do a bit of work in our startup.c# file. Again, I can open that from my Solution Explorer, and in this file, there are two things I need to do. Firstly, in this configure services method, I need to register MVC with the dependency injection framework of ASP.NET 5. That's a simple one-liner, and I'm going to paste it in here. You can see all I'm doing is saying services.add_MVC. That services being the argument that's going to be passed in when the configure services method is called. Secondly, in my configure method, what I'm going to do is comment out the default code in here, and we're going to actually register MVC with the Open Web Interface for .NET or OWIN. Again, that's another one-liner. So pasting that in, you can see what I'm going to do is use the app that's passed in and its use MVC function. So if I were to save this, now our application is set up to use MVC6, and the next steps you might take are starting to create models that can represent the data we pass back and forth between our client and server. Now, to get us started, I've already installed Grunt and set up some minification and watching tasks, and those are currently running. In addition to that, we've already configured our project.json file and as well our startup.c# file to ensure that MVC is all set up and ready to go. Now, as we mentioned, what we're going to be doing is creating a model object that's going to represent the data we can pass back and forth between our server and our client. In this application, we're going to be working with quotes. So we're going to create a C# class quotes to represent that kind of data. What I want to do is firstly right click on my project, and I'm actually going to create a new folder that's going to hold my models. We're only working with one model in this particular demo, but you would add all of your server-side models in a real-world application to a models folder so it's separated logically from the rest of the application. Now, with my models folder in place, I'm going to right click and add new item, and that item is going to be coming from my server-side templates, and it's going to be a C# class. As we mentioned, we're going to be working with quotes here, so I'm going to create this class, giving it a name of quote.cs, and if I were to add that, you can see where that shows up in my models folder. Now, naturally, when you create your models, you're going to capture any type of information that makes sense for you to capture. So in our quote class, we're going to define three properties. We have a numeric ID, and then we also have two strings, one for the actual content of the quote and the other for the author of the quote. What we want to do is save our C# file now, and that's going to be it for creating one simple model. And now, as potential next steps in this application, we can actually create a server-side controller that is able to pass back and forth information via a quote object. Now, what we're looking at here on screen is our model class we have already created. As you can see, we're representing a quote, and every quote is going to have an ID, some content, which is the actual quote, and then an author. So keeping this in mind, let's go ahead and create a server-side controller. Since our server is going to be API and endpoint based in this application, what I'm actually going to do is create a folder here by right-clicking on my project, going to add new folder, and I'm going to give this folder a name of API. Now, within this folder is where we're going to be housing our server-side controllers. So let's set one up, and I'm going to right-click on my API folder. Again, I'm going to be adding a new item, and this time on the server side, I'm going to be looking for the Web API Controller class. You're going to give your controller a name that makes sense. In this application, we're going to call it Quotes Controller, and then I'm going to add that. You can see where that C# file shows up in my API folder and also here on the left in the editor. Now, just at a glance, you can see I get a fair bit of boilerplate here as part of a web API controller, so I'm already ahead in that I don't need to create this code for myself. What we're looking at is a server-side controller that's going to be able to handle when requests come from the client pointing to API/controller. Obviously, this controller is going to be our quotes controller. So you can see here, we have already set up functions to deal with our basic CRUD requests. We're getting a get request here, requesting all quotes. We have another function here, get, that takes an ID so a user can request a specific quote that we return. And we also have some more functions here, post, allowing a user to create a new quote, and also put, where we can update an existing quote, and finally delete, where a specific quote can be deleted. So all of this is coming as boilerplate from the Web API Controller class, and we would add to this to create our actual application. Now, as we said, we're going to be working with our quote object, so I need to get access to that, and I can do that just by saying here using my quotes app.models. And for the time being, all we're going to concern ourselves with is implementing this get method. So again, the user is going to usually use this method to request all of the quotes that you have on the server. So we're going to return a list of quote instances. So I'm going to change this here to quote, and then I'm just going to actually hard code in a list with some random quotes that I found. In a real world application, you would probably be going out to a database and getting some records that were quotes, and then using those records to create quote instances. Here, we're just going to cheat the system a little bit. So you can see each quote here is indeed an instance of our quote class. I'm hard coding in IDs, content, and as well an author each time. Now, as it is, our API on the server side actually does have some functionality. So if I were to go ahead and save this, if we run this application, we should actually be able to request our quotes using a HTTP GET call. Now, once my server is up and running, I should be able to navigate to a web browser and verify that. So if I were to go to localhost, the port we're using is 4192. And if you remember, we actually defined our endpoint here as /API/quotes. If I were to submit that, there you can see we're getting back in JSON format the actual quotes that we just hard coded in. So now that we have verified some functionality coming from our endpoint on the server side, the next step we might take here is to start creating our actual Angular application so that on the client side, we can see more than just JSON files. Now, I'll point out we've already set up MVC6 and a server-side API to return a list of quotes, which is what you're looking at on screen right now. What we're going to be doing here is taking our first steps with the client-side Angular application. The first thing we need to do is download the JavaScript files that actually power an Angular application. ASP.NET 5 comes with the Bower Package Manager pre-installed that we can use, so we're going to use that to go out and grab our client-side Angular JavaScript files. So the first thing I'm going to do is right-click on my quotes app, and what I want to do is add a new item, and I'm going to make sure I'm on the client side here, and I'm going to be looking for a Bower configuration file. If I go ahead and add that, you can see where bower.json and also bower.rc shows up in my Solution Explorer. The configuration file lets us know that everything that we download for the client side is going to go in a subfolder lib in our www root folder. So we're going to know where to look for it after we have downloaded any dependencies using Bower. Now, if we take a look at the bower.json file, you can see the dependency section starts off empty, but we know we're going to be adding in our Angular modules here. So we may as well go ahead and do that. And I'm actually going to go ahead and paste those in. So you can see I'm setting up a few modules. One is the Angular base module. I know I'm also going to need the Angular resource module and also the Angular route module. So I'm requesting those as well. You can see they're all synchronized at the latest version at the time of this demo, which is 1.4.5. In addition, I'm going to reach out and grab both jQuery and Bootstrap because they may come in handy later on in the project. So that's all we need right now. What I'm going to do is save my bower.json file. And when I do that, Visual Studio 2015 is actually going to attempt to go out and get these modules downloaded and installed for me. If you were to take a look in my Solution Explorer, in my dependencies section, you'll see I now have a Bower section as well. Now, as of the current version of Visual Studio 2015, there seems to be a little bug concerning whether these modules get installed or not. You can see I'm getting a warning here that modules are not installed, but you can always try to right-click and restore packages to attempt to install them if they are indeed not installed. But what I find is that if I were to look in my www root folder, I have a lib subfolder and everything I need is actually set up in there. So I'm going to disregard this exclamation mark for now, hoping that it's a bug that's gone by the time you are creating your projects. So now Angular is installed for us. So the next step we would take here is to use our Angular.js files and start building out the client side of our application. Already installed MVC 6 and have set up an API that can return a list of quotes to us. On the client side, as you can see on screen, we've used Bower to help us install our Angular JavaScript files. So now what we want to be doing is creating an Angular module that's going to be our application. That is actually going to be a script file. So in my Solution Explorer, I'm going to navigate to my scripts folder here, and I'm going to right click on that, and I'm going to add a new item. In the client side template section, I'm going to scroll until I see Angular module. The default name of app.js is fine for me, so I'm going to go ahead and add that. And now you can see in our script section, we have our app.js set up for us. Now, we're not using the ng-route module just yet, so I'm going to comment it out. And also, I would like to change the name of my Angular application to my quotes app. You can change your name as you see fit, or just leave it as the default. Now, before I save my app.js, I know I'm going to be using a custom module here. So that's going to be a service that I create later on that's going to be centered around querying the server for quotes. I'm going to inject this in right away, and you can see I'm calling that service quotes service. Now again, to be clear, I have not yet defined my quote service, but I am in app.js and I know that's what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to inject it as a dependency right away. This is all it's really going to take for our initial app.js. So I'm going to save this. And what I'd like to bring your attention to is the fact that we do still have our grunt task running here. And because I have now added a JavaScript file in the scripts folder, that folder was being watched. So if I were to take a look in my www root now, we can see I have an equivalent file here, app.js, which is the minified version of the app.js file that we are working with here. In addition to that, any other JavaScript files that we place in this scripts folder is always going to be updated and added to app.js in a minified, efficient form. In any event, we now have our Angular app module all set up. So in order to create a useful application on the client side, the next step I would take is to start either defining controllers I could use, or at some point actually set up this quote service where it can interact with the quote data on the server side of things. We're going to be looking at creating a client-side Angular controller that we can make use of. To quickly get you up to speed, on the server side, we've already installed MVC 6, and we've already set up a server-side controller and API that can return to us some quotes via an HTTP GET request. On the client side, we've installed our Angular JavaScript files using Bower, and what you're looking at on screen right now is our Angular app module that we're calling My Quotes app. So now what we want to create is a client-side controller that can display some quotes in the browser. So I'm actually going to place this in the scripts file because this is going to be a JavaScript file. So I'm going to find my scripts file. I'm going to right click on that, and I'm going to be adding a new item, and that is going to be an AngularJS controller using scope. You're going to want to give the controller whatever name makes sense for your application. I'm going to call my controller the quotes controller and add that. Now, actually, to be a bit more organized, in my scripts folder, I think I'm going to add a new folder that I'm going to call controllers, and then I'm going to put my quotes controller in there. So now we have our quotes controller, and this is a client-side Angular controller, not to be confused with our server-side quotes controller. Our C# quotes controller is all about providing CRUD functions for dealing with quotes on the server. So back to our client-side quotes controller, you can see here this JavaScript template has a bit of boilerplate for us. Now, I know that I did rename my app module to my quotes app, so I'm going to need to make that change here in order to reference the same app. Our template is then setting up our controller for us, giving it a name of quotes controller because that's what we named the JavaScript file, and then also providing a controller function, quotes controller, that we can see down below. Within this function, all that's happening is we're setting up a scope variable title to quotes controller and then calling an activate function that we might build out to kick our application off in some way. I'm not going to be using any of that boilerplate, and what I'm going to be doing is making a few preemptive steps. Now, I know that I'm going to create a service that's going to help me interact with my server in order to get quote information. What I want to do is inject that service so that it's available in my quotes controller. And so I'm going to add a string quotes here to this array that's being injected into the quotes controller. Now, in my controller function, again, I'm going to make sure that my quotes service is available. And within the body of my controller function, all I'm going to be setting up is one scope variable that I'm calling quotes, and I'm going to be setting it by using my quotes service and its query function. So again, we have not defined this quotes service yet, but we do know that we are going to define it in such a way that calling this query function is going to reach out to the server and return to us a list of quotes that we can then add to our quotes scope variable and eventually display in our client-side Angular app. So I'm going to go ahead and save this controller because that's all we're going to be doing in here for now. And as I'm sure you can guess, the obvious next step is to go ahead and define this quote service that we're referencing everywhere in our controller. And as well, we're trying to inject early on in our app module. Now, to get us started, we've already installed MVC 6 and set up a server-side controller and API that can return to us some quote information via a GET request. On the client side, we've set up an Angular app module called My Quotes app that you're looking at, and you can see this is going to represent our application. It is making use of a custom module called Quote Service that we have yet to define. We also have a client-side Angular controller called Quotes Controller, and a quick glance here will show you that we're also making use of a quote service in this JavaScript file as well. So because the quote service module and this quote service do not exist, this application will not work as is. So we're going to be creating that module right now. To kick that process off, in my Solution Explorer, I'm going to find my scripts folder and I'm going to right click and create a new folder here. I'm going to call this folder services, and in my services folder, I'm going to right click, add a new item. This item is, as you can guess, going to be an Angular JS service. Now the template we would use for that is actually Angular JS Factory. So you're going to select that and give your service an appropriate name. I'm going to call my own quotes service. And then I'll use the add button to finalize. So there you can see our quote service, complete with some boilerplate code that we're not actually going to use. I'm going to select all of this and get rid of it. And we're going to paste in our own version of this service and go over that. Now, first things first, I'm going to be creating an Angular module here. And you can see I'm giving the module a name of a quotes service corresponding to the module that we're trying to inject when we create our application. Secondly, you'll notice I'm going to be injecting the ng resource module because I know I'm going to need it as part of setting up my quotes service module. Now, in order to define the actual service here, you can see I'm going to be using the factory method of my module and giving my service a name of quotes. In the second argument to my factory method, I'm defining an array here, and the first element of this array is the resource service that I'm going to inject because I know I need that as part of my actual service function. Now, within this function, you can see I'm going to be making use of the resource service, and this resource service gives me an easy way to work with RESTful APIs on the server. The first argument here is going to be the API endpoint of interest. We're talking about quotes, so that's going to be /API/quotes. The second argument we're leaving as an empty object. And this third argument actually allows us to override some of the default methods that are returned when we use this resource service. The way this function works is that when I call it, I actually get back an object, and that object has a certain amount of methods which allow me to easily create, retrieve, update, and delete resources on the server associated with the endpoint that I provided. This third argument here is just me replacing the default version of the query function that was already on the returned object to suit my needs. So now, based on this JavaScript file and our factory method, our quotes service is all set up, and it gives us an object with, among other methods, a query method that we can call that should return to us an array of quotes as specified by the server. If I go ahead and save this JavaScript file, with this file in place, in addition with my controller in place, that, as you can see, is using the query method, we should now be able to create an index.html file that will give us a place to render out the results of our Angular app so we can actually see some of this quote information in a client browser. Right now, we're focused on the client side of this application, where to get things started, we've defined a custom service that we're calling quote service that is able to reach out to a server endpoint /API/quotes and get back some quote information. In addition to that, we also have a controller that's making use of the service and setting up any returned quote information in a scope variable quotes. What we want to do now is actually define an index.html page to make use of this controller so we can see the quote information coming from the server in a client browser. Now, because our index.html is going to be a client-facing page, I'm actually going to create that directly in my www root folder in my Solution Explorer. So to do that, I'm going to right-click on the root folder and I'm going to add a new item. You should be able to scroll until you see HTML page, and I'm going to name my HTML page here index.html. It's going to be our home page. If I were to add that, now you can see our index.html page in the www root folder. And if we look at the HTML source, the first thing I need to do is use the ng app directive to activate our Angular application. We gave the application a name of My Quotes app, so we have to be sure to use that same name when we use the ng app directive. I'm also going to go ahead and customize my title in the head tag, as well as importing some script files that I know I will need. So pasting that in, you can see here, I'm going to be referencing my Angular min JavaScript file, also my Angular resource JavaScript file, and my Angular route JavaScript file. Finally, I'm referencing my app.js JavaScript file, all of which you can see is in my www root folder. Moving on my body tag, I'm going to make use of another directive, and this is the ng cloak directive, and this is going to keep the body hidden until Angular has completely loaded the data and rendered my template. Pushing on to the inside of my body tag here, what I'm going to do is define a div, and I'll paste this in, and you can see I'm going to use the ng controller directive to indicate that for this div, we're going to be making use of our quotes controller. I'll quickly show you again. Quotes controller is the one controller we have in place, and what it does is use our quotes service, specifically its query function, to get back some quotes that it then sets as a scope variable quotes. Back in index.html, we're going to go ahead and set up an unordered list where each of the list items is actually going to be created based on one of the quotes in the quotes scope variable. You can see me using the ng repeat directive to accomplish that. And for each quote, we're just going to render out the content of the quote and the author of the quote, remembering that these properties are going to be coming from the quote model that we set up earlier. There's going to be an ID, content, and author, and I can see now that I really should be using capitals here, so that should be a capital C and as well a capital A. So that's pretty much it for our index.html file. What I want to do is actually save this now, because we should be able to run this application as is, go over to our browser and get our list of quotes showing up. What we're going to be looking at is how we can set up some client-side routing for this application. To quickly get you up to speed, we're at the point now where we have our server set up with an API that can return quote information, and we've also set up an initial Angular application with one controller, quotes controller, which is actually being used in our index.html page to display some quote information. What we want to do in this demo is take the next step and set up some client routing in this Angular application so that we can have dynamic views being substituted in based on the URL that our client provides. In order to do any of this, we're going to need to use the Angular routing features, which we can get from the Angular route module that we already have installed thanks to Bower. You can see it over here in my lib folder in my www root folder. There is our Angular route JavaScript file, and I'll quickly point out that in my index.html file, I'm already referencing that Angular route min JavaScript file. So next, what I want to do is hop over to app.js, and I actually want to inject the ng route module, since this is the module that's going to be providing our client-side routing capabilities. So I'm going to save this. Before taking our next step is actually to define a config function for our Angular app module, my quotes app. And in that config function, we're going to use the route provider service that is coming from the ng-route module to define some client-side routes. Now, I'm going to paste all of that in and we'll go through it. So now if I get us a bit more space here, you'll see that the first thing we're doing is we're going to be accessing our app module. Remember, again, that's my quotes app. And this time we're going to be setting up a config function by using the method config. So I'm passing in here an array. And the first and second elements in this array are services that I'm going to need as part of setting up my client-side routing. This third argument is actually the function that sets up the client-side routing. So you can see I passed in the route provider and also the location provider into this function, and I'm going to be using here the route provider, its when function, to set up 4 client-side routes. The first is just a default route /. The second is /quotes /add. The third being /quotes /edit. And you'll also notice this :ID here, which allows me to take a dynamic ID that I can match to one of my quotes. Also, my last route here, /quotes /delete :ID, also allows me to take a dynamic ID parameter. So it should be fairly clear what these routes are all about. This default route is just going to list all of the quotes. Then we have another route that's going to deal with adding, one that's going to deal with editing or updating, and one that's going to deal with deleting or removing. So our CRUD functions are represented by these 4 client-side routes. You'll also notice that for each of the routes, I'm able to define both a template URL, which indicates some HTML that should be rendered for this route, and also a separate controller that's going to handle this route. The last thing I'll point out inside of this function is down at the very bottom here, I'm going to be using the location provider, its HTML5 mode function, setting that to true to make sure that I can use friendly and natural URLs and avoid using hashbangs for my client-side routing. So that's all it's going to take to set up some client-side routes. We see what they look like, but right now this will not work because we have not defined any of these referenced HTML pages, quotes, add, edit, and delete. And there are also 3 controllers here that we need to define in order to make things work. Up to speed, we've already defined our server-side API that's going to return some quote information to us, and we've already set up an Angular app on the client side, and what you're looking at is the beginning of some client-side routing that we're attempting to work with. So what I want to show you here is we have some routes like /quotes /add that are not going to work as expected right now. I'm going to run this application. And once it pops up, my default route should work fine. But if I were to try to go to quotes add, for instance, you can see I'm going to get a 404 error here coming back from the server. Now, we might not expect that because we think we are setting up client-side routing, but right now, because these requests are making it all the way to the server knows nothing about our client-side ambitions, so that's why we're getting back the 404. What we want to do is make a change here. So rather than getting back a 404 error, the server actually rewrites everything or redirects everything to the Angular homepage, that is our index.html page, which then allows the Angular app to handle its own routing. So now to get this done, what I'm going to do is on my www root folder, I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a new item. This time, the item I'm going to be adding is a simple text file, but I'm going to be naming it web.config. Once you have that set up, go ahead and add it And in this web.config file, what we're going to be doing is setting up some rules that is going to change how our server responds to certain requests. So I'm going to paste this in here, and you'll recognize this as an XML file. But what's important about this file is that we're setting up some rewrite rules here, or one rule specifically that we're calling index home rule. And when it matches certain URLs, you can see where it's going to rewrite the action as if the request were for the homepage index.html. So let's go ahead and save our web.config now and run our application one more time. So once that pops up, again, I expect my home page to work fine. But if I were to go to quotes add, I believe it was, now you can see we're no longer getting that 404 error. We're getting what appears to be an Angular page that simply isn't rendering properly. So it does appear that our rewrite rules on the server are working fine. Now, if we were to go quickly back to Visual Studio and stop this, the reason that our quotes add page still is not going to work is because we still have to define this add.html and as well this quotes add controller. So that would be the next logical step to take in the progression of this Angular application. API set up to deliver some quote information from this app. We're looking at our quotes controller right now. And for the time being, we're just returning some hard-coded quote information. Now, we also have our AngularJS application started. So in my index.html, you can see where I'm creating my Angular application, my quotes app. And right now it's pretty simple. We're using just one controller, quotes controller, to basically present a list of quotes by using the ng repeat directive. So we're ready to take the next step with this application, and rather than just using this one controller to display the same list of quotes at all times, what we want to do is set up some client-side routing. So in app.js, you can see where I've used the route provider here to set up a certain amount of controllers and templates that are going to allow me to provide CRUD information, or create, retrieve, update, and delete information for the quotes in our application. So you can see here we have controllers, quotes controller, quotes add, quotes edit, and quotes delete controller, as well as some separate templates for each one. What we want to do now is start defining these controllers. And the way we're going to do this is, rather than creating a separate JavaScript file for each individual controller here, we're going to define them all in our quotes controller JavaScript file. If I were to open that up, you'll see that we already have one controller set up here, just the basic quotes controller, and that's the one that's being used here in the more basic form of the application. We're going to keep this controller, but we're also going to add three more controllers: add, edit, and delete. So let's get into that now. So right below where I'm going to access my Angular application and add the initial controller, I'm going to chain on some other controllers. So pasting that in, you can see quite simply here, we set up three more controllers: add, edit, and delete, indicating the functions that define each of those controllers. So if we were to scroll further down, obviously so far we only have a function for our quotes controller, so we're going to come in here with three more functions. I'm just going to paste these in here, and I'll firstly contract them all so that we can clearly see that these three functions we're defining, quotes add controller, quotes edit controller, and quotes delete controller, do in fact coincide with the controller functions we said we were going to provide. Also, you'll notice into each of these individual functions, I'm providing any dependencies that I know they're going to need. So my quotes add controller obviously is going to need a scope, as well as each of the other controllers. It's obviously going to need the quotes service, and it also needs the location service. Now let's jump into our quotes add controller. Naturally, from the name, you can tell we want to create or provide the functionality to allow someone to add a quote to our application. To do that, we're going to create a new scope variable quote using our quote service. And you'll notice we're also going to create a scope function here, add quote, which is going to be submitting a quote to the server by using the quote services save method. in its callback, when the code has been submitted, we're just going to redirect the application to its home page. So pretty simple. Let's move on here. And you'll see in my quotes edit controller where we're going to allow the user to update a specific quote. We're going to get the quote to be updated by using the route params service. We're going to be able to figure out the ID of the quote in question by getting it from the route. And once we do figure it out, we're going to reach into the server and get the appropriate quote, again using our quote service. This time it's get method providing that ID. That's going to be provided to the front end. A user is going to be able to make any changes they deem necessary, and then they're going to take advantage of our edit quote function, which is going to submit the updated quote record to the server. So that's our edit or update functionality. Finally, we have our quotes delete controller, which again is going to be using the route params to get an ID and retrieve a specific quote. And then what we're going to do is provide this function delete quote, where we can use the remove method of our quotes service, tell the server that we want to get rid of a specific quote. So that's pretty much all we're going to do in terms of setting up our CRUD functionality for our application here. We started out with some controllers that we needed to define, and now that we have defined those, we're in a better position. Obviously, none of this is going to work at this point, because if I were to go back to app.js, you can see that in addition to having these controllers in place, I also need to have my template URLs, my individual AngularJS views that go along with these controllers. The next step I would take is to start defining my add.html, edit.html, and delete.html partial views. Once we get that under control, then naturally we would go back to index.html and update our page. So instead of using the singular quotes controller, we would use ngView and get some real client-side routing going on. Server-side API to serve some quote information to the client-side AngularJS application. And in this AngularJS application, as you can see in our app.js file, we have defined some client-side routing. We're specifying 4 controllers here to give us CRUD operations for working with the server's quote information. So you can see here the root URL / is going to allow us to retrieve all of the quotes from the server. /quotes / add is going to allow us to create a new quote. /edit with a variable ID is going to allow us to update an existing quote, and /delete also with a variable ID is going to allow us to delete or remove a specific quote from the server. All of the necessary controllers that you see being referenced in app.js here are already created and provided in my quotes controller JavaScript file. So what we need to look at now is providing these partial views, these partial templates for the controllers to use so that our client-side routing can be fully implemented. In this particular video, we're just going to look at providing templates for allowing us to address our retrieve functionality and also our create functionality. So specifically, quotes.html, which is going to retrieve and display a list of quotes, and add.html, which is going to allow us to submit a new quote to our server backend. Now, as far as what we're looking at on screen, you can see that both of these files are referenced as being a child in a partials folder. So let's get that created. I'm going to open my www root folder, right click here, and I want to add a new folder. As you can guess, I'm going to give this folder a name of partials. And once I have that in place, I'm going to add in my 2 HTML files. So quotes and add, using the same process here, I can right click. I want to add a new item. It's going to be a client-side HTML page. So I'm going to find that template and I'm going to name the first one add. And obviously the second HTML file here, we're going to call quotes. You can see where Visual Studio is going to give us a full HTML template, but we don't need all of that. Remember, we're only defining a partial view that's going to be substituted into our AngularJS application. So for quotes.html, if I paste in what we're interested in, we're just going to be providing one div to display all of the quotes coming back from the server. We're going to display them in an unordered list, and you can see us using the ng repeat directive to go after or access the quotes scope variable and set up a paragraph that's going to output for each quote its content and also its author. At the very bottom here of this template, we have one link here allowing us to add a new quote, and you can see where that's going to reference our client-side route /quote/add. When our app user clicks on that link, they're going to be routed to our client-side route, which itself is going to depend on our add.html file. So let's look at add.html. Again, we don't need all of the full HTML template provided to us, since all we're going to be setting up in this partial view is a div here, and this div contains a form. As you might guess, this form is going to allow the user to input some information for a new quote. We're going to bind the information that the user enters into these input fields to a scope variable quote by way of the ng model directive. So you can see here we're going to capture some content for the quote. We're going to capture an author for the quote, and when the user uses our form to submit by pressing on the save button, we're going to be calling a scope function here, add quote, which behind the scenes in our controller is going to submit this quote object to the server quotes controller, whose job is to deliver quote information to the client-side AngularJS application. Right now, it's pretty basic in that it's really only going to deliver a list of 3 hard-coded quotes that we have set up here. Now, over on the client side of this application, in my app.js file, you'll notice that I have configured some routes here, some client-side routes for use. So you can see here, depending on when the user goes to either //quotes add, /quotes edit, providing a variable ID or a dynamic ID, I should say, and finally /quotes delete, also with a dynamic ID, we're going to match those routes, load specific template URLs and specific controllers to power those partial views. I'll also quickly point out that we're also using the location provider here, its HTML5 mode property, setting it to true, which allows us to work with more friendly URLs in our actual application. Now, we're looking at the route provider. We have these routes set up here, but if I were to go to index.html, you can see that we're not actually making use of those routes right now. Instead, when this application is loaded, it's always going to use quotes controller. It's always going to look for the quotes scope variable on that controller and then just output a list of whatever quotes those are. We want to get rid of this, and we want to now get set up so that our routes can actually drive us to different views, different parts of the application. So back in index.html, the first thing I'm going to do is inside of my head tag, I'm going to add a tag here, base, and I'm going to set its href attribute to /. This is necessary so that the location provider can work properly because it needs a base to work. Now that that's done, I'm going to come back into the body here of this index.html, and where we were just using that one controller before to display the list of quotes, I'm going to get rid of all of that and simply paste in our usage of the ng view directive. If I go ahead and save the application at this point, that's pretty much all to it. Based on my use of this ng view directive and also the routes that we set up here using our route provider, when this application is running, depending on whatever the client-side route is, ng view is going to be able to deliver the correct partial view and also the correct controller to power that view. So here now the client-side routes are set up using the route provider, and the ng view directive is set up to help us display the partial views. I'll mention that the next step we need to take is ensuring that these template URLs, these HTML files are in place, and also that these controllers that are powering the partial views are in place. In my quotes controller.js file, I do have my controller functions good to go. So what really needs to happen now is that in my application, I need to set up this partials folder that's being referenced, and then in that folder, create these HTML files, these partial views, quotes, add, edit, and then finally delete. And this is our server-side API. Its job is to provide CRUD functions for allowing the client side, the front end Angular application, to create, retrieve, update, and delete quote information. Now, as far as functionality wise, this class here, quotes controller, does work. It does provide all of the necessary REST functions. The issue is that we're not actually storing or retrieving the quote information that's being provided from a database, from a persistent store. If we quickly take a look at the functions provided by quotes controller, you'll notice that when an HTTP GET comes in, we're returning a list of hard-coded quote objects. Further to that, when GET request comes in for a specific quote, we're not actually doing anything, and we're not doing anything for any of the other REST functions, those being post, put, and delete. What we want to do is get set up so that these functions being provided by the server are backed by an actual persistent store, MS SQL database in this case. We're going to be using Entity Framework 7 in this application to help us create and manage our persistent store. So now, before we can take any kind of other steps, what we need to do is get this application set up to work with Entity Framework 7. We're going to be using the NuGet package manager to help here. What I'm going to do is in my Solution Explorer, I'm going to find my project.json file, open that up, and in my project.json file, in the dependencies object, I'm going to need to add a few dependencies. So pasting those in, you'll quickly see that they're both entity framework related. The first one here is entity framework.sql server. As we mentioned, our persistent store in this demo is going to be an SQL server database. And my second dependency here is entity framework.commands. You'll notice I'm going to be using version 7.0.0-beta 5. When you're creating your application, you're going to want to use the latest version available to you, more than likely, and you're going to want to make sure that you're using the same version for everything entity framework related. So I'm going to go ahead and save my project.json file. And now Visual Studio is going to update. And after some time, if I were to scroll to my references folder in my Solution Explorer and expand that out, you'll be able to see here my entity framework dependencies now in place, ready for use. The next step I might take in this application is to start thinking about creating our DB context or database context classes to help us work with the actual eventual SQL Server database. Server-side controller, and right now it's set up to be able to deliver CRUD functionality from the server to the front end. So overall, we're working with quote information in this application. So our quotes controller here can handle GET requests. It can handle post, put, and delete requests for serving up or updating quote information on the server. Even though the CRUD functionality is in place in terms of method shells, we are not actually saving that information in a database. We're going to be looking at how we can use Entity Framework 7 to help us actually create this database to work along with our quotes controller. Now, in my project.json file, I've already gone ahead and set up my dependencies for Entity Framework. And the persistent data store we're going to be looking at is going to be an SQL Server database and some associated tables. As I mentioned earlier, our whole application here, my quotes app, is about working with quotes, and I have a quote class file here, which is going to be our data model. Every individual quote is going to have three properties: an ID, some content, and an author. So now with my quotes controller in place, my entity framework dependencies set up, and also my data model in place, what I need to do is think about creating a DB context class. That's an entity framework class that's going to work along with our quote model in this case to help us talk to our eventual SQL server. So to get this going now, I'm going to come over to my Solution Explorer. I'm going to find the models folder. This is the same folder with my quote C# file, and I'm going to create a new class here. So we're going to give this class a name of quotes context, or quotes app context, I should say. Make sure it's a C# class and add that. Once we have our quotes app context ready to go, I'm going to jump over to the left here, and the first thing I'm going to do is get set up to use the entity framework. Pasting that in, you can see here using Microsoft.data.entity, and that's going to give me the DB context class. So now I'm going to make sure that my class is a subclass of DB context, and instances of DB context are the main objects that we use for interacting with data in Entity Framework 7. So moving on here and jumping into our quotes app context, I'm just going to paste in one public property. So you can see here, it's a DB set of type quotes. I'm giving it a name of quotes, and this property is going to represent collections of entities, quotes in this case, and will help us define the eventual tables in our SQL Server database. So now in our application source here, we have our quote model set up. We have our DB context class set up to work with that model. Next, what we would think about is registering our DB context with this application and then setting up the configuration for connecting to and working with the eventual SQL Server database. 7 on the back end to help us interact with our persistent store, which is going to be an SQL Server database. Now, our demo app is all about working with quotes. And to help us do that, we actually have a C# class here, quote. This is going to act as our data model. And in addition to this, we've already gone ahead and set up a class here, quotes app context, which is a subclass of DB context to help us work with the quotes that are going to be in the SQL Server database. What we're thinking about in this particular demo is registering the entity framework services for use with our application. To do that, we're going to need to open our startup.cs file. I'm going to find that in my Solution Explorer on the right. And once I open it up, along with my models namespace, which contains my quote model class and also my quotes app context DB context file, I'm going to be referencing a few other namespaces that I need to help me with this configuration. Once that's done, I'm going to get into the class itself and I'm going to create a property here that's going to hold my configuration information. You can see as I paste this in, this is going to be of type iConfiguration, and I'm giving the property a name configuration. Next, I'm going to actually create a constructor for my startup class. So if I were to paste this in, you can see here this constructor is going to get two arguments here, an iHosting environment, env, and an iApplication environment, app-env. Inside of my constructor, I'm going to be creating a variable here that I'm calling configuration builder. It's going to be an instance of configuration builder, and I'm actually going to pass it here one argument app environment.application base path. That's basically going to help me set up the base path for my configuration. Next, I'm going to call two methods on my configuration builder object. One is add JSON file, indicating to it a JSON file config.json, which is a string, and then I'm also going to call add environment variables. Finally, I'm going to set my original configuration object here by calling my configuration builders build method. So you obviously notice that I'm getting an error here around my usage of add JSON file, and this is because I'm missing one dependency. I'm going to go over to my project.json file and I'm going to set up one more dependency here. So pasting that in, it's a dependency here on Microsoft.framework.configuration.json. If I were to save this and go back to my startup file here, eventually once my packages update, that error should go away. So now with our configuration object in place, we can move down here to the configure services function, where to date all we're calling is this add MVC method to help us set up MVC. What I'm going to paste in here is another call, this one all about helping us register our entity framework service. So if I were to paste that in, you'll see here the method I'm using is add entity framework, and I'm also chaining on a few other method calls here. Add SQL server. We know we're trying to work with an SQL server here, and also add DB context. And obviously the DB context we're talking about in our quotes app is our quotes app context. Now, when I call add DB context here, I'm actually passing in some configuration information. You can see here I'm saying use SQL server, and then to that method, I need to pass a valid connection string to my SQL server. Now, we're going to be providing that string from our configuration object, the same object we created earlier. So you can see me accessing that object's data connection string property. Now, what I want to point out is when we did create this configuration object earlier, when we set it up here using the configuration builder, we indicated that we were going to add a file config.json. That file we have not created yet, but when we do create it, we're going to make sure it's valid JSON and that it actually has a path data connection string that contains this actual connection string. So as you might deduce, the next step in making sure that this particular configuration works well and is complete is to go on and create this config.json file in my project and make sure it has in it a connection string that can be used. Store that information in an SQL Server database, and to do that, we're going to be using Entity Framework 7. In my startup file for the application, I've already configured the application to work with Entity Framework 7 by using a configuration object as well as a configuration builder. You'll notice here that when I do use the configuration builder, I'm indicating the use of a JSON file here, config.json. Also, down in my configure services function where I register the entity framework service with my application, I'm again using my configuration object, that's the actual config.json, to provide my connection string. So in order for any of this to work, what we need to do now is actually get this config.json file in place. So to do that, I'm going to come over to my Solution Explorer, and on the same level with my project.json file, I'm going to create a new file here, and you can guess the name here. It's going to be config.json. Right-clicking on my quotes app, I'm going to be looking to add a new item, going to look for the text file template here, and we're going to give this file a name of config.json. Once that's added to the project, we can open it up, and while there is some flexibility in how you set up your JSON file, how you set up your specific configuration properties, based on our startup file here, we need to have a certain path in place. So again, in my configure services, when I refer to my configuration file, you can see here I'm accessing data connection string. So back in config.json, if I were to paste this in addition to setting up a site title here, what's important is you'll notice I'm setting up one property data here. That's an object, and that object has another property connection string, and that value is a valid connection string to our simple SQL Server database. Naturally, when you set up your application, you're going to use your own valid connection string, but just make sure that when you do create this config.json file, it coincides with the way you were using it in your startup and your registration. So that's pretty much all we have to do in order to provide that configuration information in a JSON format. Now that we have that in place, Entity Framework is all set up. So what I would think about doing next is actually setting up my server-side quotes controller in such a way that when it responds to the client-side requests, the CRUD requests, it's actually going to be accessing and providing information coming from a persistent store, that again being our SQL Server database. Basically provides an API for working with quote information to the front-end Angular app. If we take a look at this controller, its implementation right now, it's incomplete. When we have a HTTP GET request coming in for a list of quotes, we're basically returning a hard-coded list. Ideally, this should be coming from a database. Moving on here, when we have a GET request for a specific quote identified by an ID, we're not doing anything, we're returning a string here, so we have yet to implement this method. And as well for the methods post, put, and delete, we need to provide a suitable implementation that's going to take advantage of our database, this quote information in our SQL Server database. So to get that going, we're going to be using Entity Framework 7, and I've already created a database context class here. I've given that a name of quotes app context. You can see it has one public property quotes, a DB set of type quote, which we're going to be using to help us implement working with our SQL Server persistent quote data in our quotes controller. First things first here, inside of my quotes controller class, I'm going to create a private property, giving it a name of DB context. You can see it's going to be of type quotes app context, and right below that, I'm going to define a constructor for our quotes controller class. Since my DB context is registered as a service for this application, I can take advantage of dependency injection to get it into my controller, and you can see that's what we're doing in the constructor. We're going to set our private property by using the DB context that's passed in when this class is created. So now that we have our DB context in place, we actually have a way to interact with our SQL Server database. Let's first update our HTTP GET here that's supposed to return a list of quotes. I'm going to get rid of this hard-coded list, and I'm going to return the result of a call to dbcontext.quotes. Remember again, quotes is that one property we set up here. So our DB set, our way to reach into the database and get information. So that's pretty simple. Now we can return a list of quotes directly from the database. Let's move on here. Where we have our second get method, this time it's going to take an ID. So this method should be returning information about a specific quote identified by an ID. I'm going to get rid of the shell here, paste in our implementation, and so you can see we're going to take the ID, figure out what quote it belongs to, if any, by using our dbcontext.quotes, its first or default function, and passing in the ID in question. So if we get back a quote, if this quote with a particular ID did exist in the database, then my variable here, quote, is going to be non-null. So we're just going to return a new object result based on that quote. If my quote is null, so our query returned nothing, then we're going to return a HTTP not found result. So that's it for handling GET requests, both for an entire list of quotes and also for a specific quote. Let's move on here and look at handling post requests. Now, basically a post request should allow us to be able to create a new quote. So we should be able to get some information from the client side, information that can represent a quote that we submit to the database to have a new quote stored persistently. As before, we're going to get rid of the shell and paste in our implementation, and we'll see what that looks like. My post method is going to be passed in a quote object. I'm going to check and see, does that quote object have an ID? If it does not, or the ID is equal to 0, then I know that this quote does not exist in my database server at this point in time. I'm going to create it by using my DB context here, saying quotes.add and passing in that quote, making sure to save my changes by using the save changes method of the DB context. At that point, I'm going to return a new object result based on my quote to the front end. Now, if my quote that was passed in had a valid ID, then it's possible that that quote did already exist in the database. So rather than create a new quote, we're going to update an existing quote. In order to do that, I'm first going to search for that existing quote based on the ID. And then I'm going to update its two properties of interest, those being author and content, by using the information coming from the quote that was passed in. Once my existing quote is updated, I'm going to again save the changes, and then I'm going to return the updated quote object. So that's it for our post function, and we're handling two different use cases in here actually. We're handling both creating a new quote and also updating an existing quote. Moving on here, In my put method, this is also a place where you can handle updating an existing quote. So I'm going to paste in more or less the same code that we took a look at in the post for handling an update. So search for an existing quote, update it, and then save the result. Finally, the last method we need to handle in our REST-based quotes controller is delete. So when a HTTP delete comes in, it's going to come in with a specific ID referring to a quote that we want to delete from our database. As we've done before, when we've had an ID to work with, we're going to find the quote that may exist in the database based on that ID. And if I do find it, I'm going to call the remove function of my dbcontext.quotes property, passing in the quote to be removed. After I save those changes, I'm going to return an HTTP status 200 to my client. So now at this point, if I were to save my quotes controller here, it now has the ability to handle the REST-based requests coming from the client, allowing it to create, retrieve, update, and delete quote information from an SQL Server database. The server-side backend class that gives us CRUD functions for working with quotes stored in our SQL Server database. To do that, it's using Entity Framework 7 and a DB context subclass quotes app context for actually interacting with the database. At this point, however, this app will not work because the SQL Server database we're talking about has yet to be created. With everything in place that we've looked at so far, we're going to see how we can use database migrations to help us create the actual SQL Server database and tables that we need. So now the first thing I need to do in Visual Studio is open my project.json file. In this file, we're going to need to make sure some dependencies are in place so that we can use the Entity Framework migration commands. In my project.json, you can see I already have my Entity Framework.commands property set up. And so I'm going to jump into my commands property where I only have one property web so far. So I'm going to add in another key value pair into this object, that being EF, and the actual value here being entity framework.commands. So I'll save my project.json file. And the next thing we need to do is open up a command prompt to our project folder. So once I have that set up, I'm going to run a command here, dnu restore, to make sure all of my packages are up to date. And once that's complete, I'm going to run another command here, dnx.ef migration add initial. And executing this command is going to add some code to my project that's going to allow Entity Framework to update MySQL database schema. If we go back to Visual Studio very quickly here, you'll notice I now have a migrations folder in the Solution Explorer, and this is the code I'm talking about. So now, to keep the ball rolling, I'll remind you here that in my config.json file, I've set up a connection string to connect to the MySQL server that's already running. It's running on the local host, and the database we're going to be working with is MyDemoDB. Now, if I quickly pull up SQL Server Management Studio, I can show you here my demo DB, and in the table section, you'll notice I only have a few tables here, none related to quotes. If we go back over to our command prompt now and run one more command to actually apply our migration, that's going to be dnx period ef migration apply. Once I were to execute that, and it looks like I have a typo here. This should be EF. So let me quickly type that again. That looks better. So if I were to execute this command, that should actually create that database for me. Once I get the message here that my migration has been applied, if I go back to my SQL Server Management Studio, I should be able to refresh here. And now you can see we have our quote table in our database. And if I were to expand it out, you can see that the columns in this table are author, content, and as well a primary key, ID. So this particular table has been set up in our MyDemoDB, our SQL Server database, to work along with the rest of our ASP.NET 5, MVC6, AngularJS web application. Accept and store quote information coming from the front end client, our AngularJS application. The issue right now, however, is that there's no validation in place. Anything we submit can turn into a valid quote in our database. What we want to do is set up our first level of validation, and that's going to be on the client-side form that we're looking at. In Visual Studio here, we're looking at our partial HTML file, add.html, and you can see it has a form basically allowing us to accept some information for a quote, that is some content and also an author. On submission, the quote function add quote is called, and that's what actually takes care of sending that information over to the back end. Now, to get started here, what I want to do is give this form a name. So I'm going to paste that in. I'm going to call it add quote form. And because we said we're going to be using AngularJS validation here instead of regular HTML validation, I'm going to use the noValidate attribute on my form. This is going to make sure we don't get any conflicts between that HTML built-in validation and what we're going to set up right now. Next, I want to jump down into my form fields here. So we have two inputs as we touched on earlier, one for the content of the quote, one for the author of the quote. And what I want to do is make my validation fairly simple. We just want to demonstrate the point. So I'm going to just make sure that both fields are provided. I'm going to use the ng required directive to do so, setting that to true. So that's pretty much it for our validation. Naturally, in your application, you may have more strict requirements like formats or minimum lengths, but we're just going to make sure all of our fields here are provided. That's good enough for the client side for right now. And the last thing I'm going to do is down by my save button, what I want to do is actually disable this if Angular has determined that the form is invalid. I can do that by using the ng disable directive here. And you can see I'm going to bind this to the value of add code form dot $invalid. Add code form is the name we just gave the form, and this $invalid is provided by Angular and handled behind the scenes. If any of my form fields are failing validation, invalid is going to be true, and so the save button here is going to end up disabled. So that's that. Another thing that Angular is going to do behind the scenes for me is add and remove certain CSS classes to my form fields that are going to indicate whether it's currently valid or not. I can actually use these classes to help me give visual indications to our user. So to get that going, what I want to do is actually create a styles.css file for my project. In my www root folder, I'm going to right click here and we're going to add a new item. This is going to be a client side item and it's going to be a style sheet. We're just going to call it styles.css and go ahead and add that. So now we can see our styles.css file. I'm going to get rid of the body tag here and paste in some selectors for the classes we're talking about. So on any of my input fields that are now valid or invalid, Angular is going to be adding these ng valid or ng invalid classes. And depending on whether the field has been interacted with or not, I'm going to have this touched class as well. So as you can see, valid inputs are going to have a light green background color and invalid inputs are going to have hot pink as their background color. Last but not least in this whole process is to actually link to this style sheet. So in my index.html, I'm just going to add a link tag here pointing to our new style sheet, and now our client-side validation should be good to go. Now, if I were to build this program, everything's going to be saved. And when my application pops up now, we start off here at our home page. We don't have any quotes, so there's nothing listed. But if I were to click my add a new code button, there we can see our add.html form, unvalidated and untouched. So if I were to enter in something here now, you can see if I put an A and another A, I get green. So validation is complete, everything is passing, my save button is enabled, but if I were to remove one, you can see that hot pink and save actually is disabled. So we've successfully implemented some AngularJS front-end client-side validation for our form. The next thing we would think about is providing some back-end, some server validation, since that is very necessary as well. We have just set up some client-side validation for one of our AngularJS forms. You can see that on the screen, and it's going to make sure that when a quote is provided, to our backend server, it actually has valid strings for both the content and the author of that quote. So this is validation on the client side, and it's a good first step, but it's not actually protecting our backend. Any other client, not this AngularJS application, can attempt to provide values to our server, and those would be unvalidated. What we need to do is jump back over into Visual Studio and actually set up some server-side validation in addition to the client-side validation that's already in place. Now, this process starts off in our data model. In this application, we're modeling quote information. And if I were to scroll to the models folder in my Solution Explorer, you can see my one main model file here, quote.c#. If I were to open that up, you can see right now a quote has just an ID for database and uniqueness purposes, and then the content and the author that we expect to see. Here, we're going to be setting up validation by using some annotations. I'm going to first get set up to use the data annotations namespace, and then down into my quote, what I'm going to say is I cannot have a valid quote created if both my content and my author are not meaningful non-blank strings. So to do that, I'm going to set up the required annotation, which I'll paste in once for content and again for author. And you'll notice when I set this up, I'm actually able to provide an error message here, which is what I would like to eventually have get back to my user if indeed what they entered was invalid. So if the content fails server-side validation, we're going to try to tell the user that each quote needs some content. And if the author property fails, we're going to say each quote must have an author. Now, I know in this demo that these two required validation rules are basically the same as what my client side is providing. So for a little bit of differentiation, what I'm going to do is add a third rule in here, and that's going to be a minimum length for my content. So now if my content string is less than 2 characters, we're also going to fail validation here. This time our error message is going to be that the quote has to be a valid sentence. So now, if I were to save this, that's all we're going to do in our model for starting to set up server-side validation. The next step we would take right now is to actually update our server-side quotes controller file, which handles incoming requests to actually reflect and respond if a quote is failing to meet the cut. Side validation support by using some annotations here, some data annotations to basically help us restrict what is valid for our quote model class. So you can see here our quote has 2 strings, content and author. Both of them are required, and also content here, we're requiring to have a minimum length of at least 2 characters. What we want to do now is continue implementing this server-side validation by actually updating our server-side API controller, that's our C# file, quotes controller, in such a way that when a post request comes in to create a new quote, if it is going to fail our server-side validation, we need to get a message back to the user to reflect what happened. So in quotes controller, I'm going to look for my post function. I'm going to scroll a bit and here we have it. And the way things are working now, if we get a post request here to create a new quote in our database, we're going to check for an ID. If the ID is 0, we're going to create a new quote. If there is an ID, we're going to update an existing quote. What we're saying here now is we're not going to do any of this until first making sure that the information for the quote that was provided is valid as far as our server-side validation, the annotations we just set up, are concerned. Now, I'm going to go ahead and update my post method here by just pasting in an entirely new block of code. So you can see here, all of our initial code still exists. It's just wrapped within another if statement. What I'm checking here is my model. I'm saying here, if my model state is valid property is true, then we carry on as usual to either create a new quote or update an existing quote. But if that model state is not true, if it's false, if it's failing validation, then I'm going to return here a new bad request object result passing in the model state. Now, within the ecosystem we're working with, this model state variable is available to us. It's managed behind the scenes, and so we can use it, or specifically its is valid property as we are, to make sure that the quote that we're talking about here is good enough to pass our server-side validation. If it's not, this bad request object result that we're sending back is actually going to go back to the client as a HTTP response with a 400 status code and also our associated model state errors. So things are looking good here for our server-side validation. What we want to do is run this application and test it out. So if I were to pull up my browser, and once that loads up, I'm also going to pull up my inspector so we can see what's happening. And first, we're going to attempt to add a new quote. So we're going to go to the add a new quote. We're going to enter in some valid information here. And you'll notice both of my inputs went green here, meaning we passed the client-side validation. So I can go ahead and save this. At which point I'm taken back to my main page and you can see our quote. So if we were to go back and try to add another new quote where I'm going to intentionally set my content to be too short and the author doesn't really matter, if I were to submit that, now, if you were to take a look down here in our network tab, you can see I'm getting a response here of 400. And if I were to take a look at the body, you can see the quote has to be a valid sentence. So that's what we set up as a message in our server-side model. And indeed, when we receive invalid information from the client, the message is getting all the way back. The next step would be for us to go from receiving this response here that we can only see in our network inspector, which obviously most users are not going to have opened, to reflecting it in our AngularJS application in some way. Validation taking place via AngularJS. We also have server-side validation set up. Now, on the client side, I'm not going to be able to click save and actually submit anything to the server unless content and author are provided for a quote. And if I do submit a quote to the server and it fails the server-side validation, then I'm going to get back an HTTP response with a 400 status code, as you can see here. And also I'm going to get back an error message from the server letting me know exactly why the input was invalid. So what we need to do now is take this response that we're getting back in the case of failed validation and actually have it show up in our AngularJS application so the user can have some idea of what went wrong. So now back over in Visual Studio 2015, there we can see add.html, the partial HTML view that actually is behind the add quote form we just saw in the browser. And we're going to be working with the controller for this partial, and that's located in my quotes controller.js file. And it's actually going to be a function here that we set up that we're calling quotes add controller. The actual process of submitting a quote to the server is going to happen in this add quote function here, which is run when the submit button on our add form is pressed, and you can see the ng submit directive kicking off that scope function. Now, within here, you can see I'm going to be calling the $save function of a new quote that I created. That's what's going to submit to the server. And I have a callback here for when a successful response comes back. Basically, we're just going to go back to the home page. What I want to set up now is another callback function. This time, if there's an error coming back, because that's what's going to kick in when we get that HTTP response with a 400 status code. The place that function would go would be right after our success callback function. So I'm going to add in a comma and paste that in. So this function, our error function or failure function, is going to actually be passed an error object. We're going to grab that object and we're going to be using the information inside of this error object, which, as I'm sure you can guess, is going to contain our validation errors. What I'm doing is calling another utility function here, a helper function that I'm calling display server-side validation errors, and I'm just passing in both my scope here and also the error object that this callback received. Next, what we want to do is actually define this function. So I'm going to scroll down here to the bottom of my file and paste in an implementation. So there's our display server-side validation errors. And you can see the first thing it's doing is it's going to create a scope variable called validation errors and initialize it to an empty array. Then I'm going to reach into that error object that I received from my failure callback, looking for its data property. Now, because I have an understanding of what the structure is of information coming back from the server, I know that I can loop through each of the keys in this error object, each time accessing the element at index 0, and that's going to be a valid error message. Basically, we're going to grab all of those error messages and add them to our validation errors array. So now that I have this function in place and also this validation errors variable, what I want to do is save my quotes controller and go back over to my partial angular view file here. I'm going to add in a new div here, and this div is basically going to be responsible for displaying our validation errors if there are any. So pasting that in, you'll notice the entire div is going to be hidden or shown based on our validation errors scope variable. So if we do have errors, we're going to see this div. If not, nothing is going to show up. Within the div, I'm going to use the ng repeat directive to create a series of paragraphs, one for every actual error message. So that's all to it. I'm going to save this and I'm going to make one more small change here going into my styles.css file. Remember here we set this up as a class validation errors, and I'm just going to make the text color red. At this point, everything should be set up and our error messages coming from the server side should now be picked up and actually displayed in our AngularJS client-side application. Let's quickly run the application and verify that. So once that application loads up, there we can see we have it in the browser. There's one quote currently stored in our database, and I want to add a new quote, except I'm not actually going to add a valid quote because I'm going to make sure that my content is too short and my author doesn't really matter. I just need to provide something. So if I were to now attempt to save here, you can see we get that response coming back in red from the server saying that the quote has to be a valid sentence. And this is because that server-side validation rule, minimum length, is failing. Next method. This app basically allows users to see and edit a list of quotes. And if we switch over to Visual Studio 2015, we're looking at our home controller and its one method index, which is returning a view, which is actually our index page, as we mentioned, the Angular application. The way things are set up right now, anyone can access this application, but what we want to do is make some changes so that only users with valid accounts can get to the Angular app. To do that, I'm going to be using the authorize attribute on my home controller. So opening up the home controller one more time, I'm going to add this attribute authorize right above my class declaration. Now, in order to use this attribute, I need to get set up with a particular namespace, so I'm going to let Visual Studio help me get access to the Microsoft.ASP.NET.Authorization namespace. The effect of using this authorize attribute is that now, when the user attempts to navigate to our home page, which needs to go through our home controller, if that user is anonymous, they're going to be redirected to a login view, giving them a chance to log in and then access our application. The actual URL of the redirect is going to be account login. So that's actually going to correspond to our account controller and its login method. You can see here we're returning a view, and that view is the login form that we're talking about. Now, before we take a look at our view file, we have some work here to do in our account controller. We're going to be managing our users with the help of ASP.NET Identity. So I'm going to get set up to use the ASP.NET.Identity namespace. And at the same time, I'm going to be using my models namespace as well, because we're going to be taking advantage of our application user class to help us manage our users. Dropping down into the body of my account controller here, what I want to do is set up a few things. The first thing you're going to notice here is two private variables here. One that I'm calling user manager, the other that I'm calling sign in manager. And as I mentioned, we're going to be managing users based on our application user. Below that, I'm actually going to create a constructor for this class. And you can see here where when we create an account controller now, we're going to get a user manager instance and also a sign-in manager instance that we can then work with. So that's that. And now we can take a closer look at our login method. As we touched on before, when this method is called, the user is going to be returned a login form where they can enter a username and the password. What we need is a place to handle and maintain that information so that it can be used in our MVC backend. To do that, we're going to create a model class. So in my Solution Explorer, I'm going to right click on my models folder here, add a new item. It's going to be a C# class, and I'm going to give it a name of login view model. Once we add this, we're going to jump into this actual class here, and all I'm going to do is create two properties, username and password here. And you'll notice I'm also using some annotations here to help us do a few things. I'm going to first need to paste in the data annotations namespace. And so when we set up this login view model, it's going to also help us validate our login form. So that's why you can see me here saying that a username is required, a password is required, and also I'm setting up a bit of a display name here for username and as well for password. The last thing we're doing is setting a data type on the password, and that's just going to make sure it doesn't show up in plain text in the browser. So now we have a login view model. If we go back to accountcontroller.cs now, what we need to think about is this view that's being returned. Now, our actual view file here, our MVC view, is in my views folder, my account subfolder, and there it is, login.cshtml. If I were to open that up, we haven't done anything so far. So let's jump in here and paste in an implementation and then see what we're getting done. Now, we're using Razor syntax here. So the first thing you can see us doing is linking to our login view model. Then we set up basically a regular HTML page, head, title, and all that good stuff before we go ahead and create our form. Now, our form is going to be posting to account login. So that's again going to be going back to our account controller that we'll take a look at afterwards. If you look further down in the form, you can see it's pretty simple. We're just going to attempt to collect both a username and also a password. Other than that, we have our submit button, and that's pretty much it for our login.cshtml. Let's save this, and as we mentioned, we're going to be, when this form is submitted, posting it back to our account login. So in my account controller, our current login method, as you can see with this comment here, is only going to be handling GET requests. When that post comes back, we need another method to handle that. So let's paste this method in. And the first thing you'll notice here is that we have that HTTP post attribute above it, again, making sure that this is the method that handles the post request to the login URL. When this comes in as a post request, we're going to receive a login view model instance login, and it's going to contain whatever information was added to the form. Now, because we already have ASP.NET identity set up, and we also have some users, some valid application users set up in our database, we can then use our sign-in manager here, the same sign-in manager we created initially, and its password sign-in async method to basically provide that username and the password, those that are coming from our end user, and allow the program to attempt to log in based on what's in the database. So this asynchronous method is going to return to us a result, and if this result is sign-in result.success, ASP.NET identity and our application is considering this user logged in. So now we can just redirect to our /home, which should then no longer see the user as anonymous and present to them the Angular application. If this result was not successful, we're going to add an error here and then return the login view where the user will actually be able to see the error. So that's pretty much it. Now we can save everything and run this application. And remember, before where we could actually access our Angular app directly, now that we've set up this authentication, this first level of security, when the application attempts to load up now, we should be redirected to our login page as we are. And if I were to log in with a valid user here, Lynn, with the appropriate password, this should work out and I should be then taken to my homepage where I can see all of my quote information. The Angular application after we've logged in successfully. I'm going to go ahead and do that, entering a valid username and password into my login field. And once I get to the Angular application, there we can see our list of quotes, and we've added some functionality where users can add a new quote, they can edit existing quotes, or they can also delete existing quotes. Right now, though, every user who is authenticated can do everything this application allows in terms of modifying quotes. What we want to look at is how we can control which users can do what after they are logged in based on ASP.NET identity and what claims a specific user has. I'll quickly jump over to my database here and show you that we do have two users set up there, Lynn and Wade, two valid users, and one of these users, Lynn, You can take a note at the ID there. It's actually set up with the can edit quotes claim. So we're going to allow this particular user to edit, delete, and add new quotes. And we're only going to allow the other user, Wade, to maybe see a list of quotes. So to get things going, let's go over to Visual Studio 2015. There you can see our Angular code service JavaScript file, and there's our API route that can take variable IDs, and this is what the Angular application is using to request information from the server. What we want to do in this demo is go over to our home controller.c# file, and you can see here in our index method where we return the view that is the HTML page containing our Angular single page app. Because we've already set up authorization and you can see our authorized attribute there, this index method and our Angular single page application index page are not going to be served up unless a user is already authenticated. So knowing that at this point we do have a logged in user, what I want to do is before I return my view is I want to reach out and get the claims for this logged in user. I'm going to store them so that they are available in the view before I actually call the view. We are talking claims here, so I'm going to get set up to use the claims namespace system.security.claims, and now in my index, as we mentioned, we can get those claims. I'm going to paste in a few lines here, and you can see the first thing I'm going to do is create a variable user using the identity property of the logged in user, and I'm actually going to cast that to a claims identity instance. On the next line here, you can see I'm going to set up a name property in the view bag based on my user's name, and then I'm also going to set up a can edit quotes property, which is either going to be a string true or false based on whether I can find that can edit quotes claim for the logged in user. So at this point, when my view is returned, which is going to be my index.cshtml, I'll quickly open that up. It's going to have some information in the view bag that it can use. What I can do here is actually make some of that view bag information available to my Angular app, and I'm going to do that by adding in a script, taking care to add it after my app is loaded. So pasting in this script here, you can see I'm going to access my Angular module, my quotes app, and then I'm going to set up a value here, can edit quotes, based on what's set up in the view bag. And if you remember, that's either going to be true or false. So now with this value added to my Angular application, I can actually use it by injecting it into any Angular controllers as I see fit. I'm going to open my JavaScript file here, quotes controller, and in that file, I'm going to find a specific controller, which is my quotes controller, which is responsible for displaying a list of quotes. What I want to do is inject in can edit quotes here and also into my controller function so that I can use it. And I'm actually going to set up a scope variable based on it. Naturally, we're going to call that scope variable can edit quotes as well. So now that we have a scope variable that's basically tied to whether a user has a particular claim, we can use it to either hide or show something in our Angular view. The Angular partial view that is driven by quotes controller is going to be located up higher in my partials folder in my Solution Explorer, and it's going to be our quotes.html. Let's open that up, and right now you can see it's basically for every quote that is displayed, providing both an edit link and a delete link, and also we have a link here to add new quotes. I'm going to modify this slightly to show or hide those links based on our can edit quotes scope variable, so that you can see enclosing both my edit and delete links in a span and using the ng show directive, and I'm doing the same thing for the paragraph that displays the add a new quote button. So now at this point, we should be able to save everything and run our application to give us a chance to see if our claims are altering the functionality depending on which user is logged in. To help us do that, I'm going to get two browser windows open at the same time, and in the one on the left here, I'm going to log in with a user who should have the can edit quotes claim set up, so that's Lynn, and on the right side, I'm going to log in with a user who should not have those abilities. So pasting that in and logging in, and here we can see quite clearly the user on the left is able to use all of the functionality provided by the AngularJS application in terms of modifying quotes, whereas the user on the right is restricted based on their lack of claims to only seeing what quotes are stored in the database. The app itself requires authentication before its users can see and potentially edit a list of quotes that are being maintained in the backend. The app is handling all requests to the server via an API, and so even though users have to log in to be able to use the Angular app, if I were to log out here, I'll point out that I can actually access this API directly. For instance, to see the list of quotes, I can say API quotes, and there are also functions to update, edit, and also delete quotes. Now, just because our AngularJS front end app is secured, it does not mean our API is secured, so we need to take steps to secure this on the server side as well. What we're going to look at is in Visual Studio, how can we secure our APIs? And in this case, we're actually going to restrict who can access our quotes API to only those users stored in our ASP.NET identity tables who have a claim can edit quotes. So to get this going, in my Solution Explorer, I'm going to open my startup.c# file for the application, and I'm going to scroll to the configure services method where I'm going to create an authorization policy. So pasting this in, I'm giving my authorization policy here a name of can edit quotes and creating it using an authorization policy builder. Now I need to bring in the Microsoft .ASP.NET.authorization namespace in order to use this authorization policy builder, so I'll do so. You can see here, I'm going to set up my authorization policy so that this particular policy requires the claim can edit quotes. Now, with my authorization policy in place, I can make it available to my application here by saying services.configure, and then I'm going to pass in some authorization options, and you can see in those options we're going to add our policy, giving it a name of can edit quotes and associating it with our variable. So now with that taken care of, we can go over to our web API controller. In my Solution Explorer here, I'm going to find my API folder, and there's my quotes controller.c#. So opening this up, I can use the authorize attribute to lock down any method that we want to in here. Before we can use the authorize attribute, however, we need to get set up to use the authorization namespace. So I'm going to paste that in at the very top. And then we're going to jump down into the controller body and pick some things here to lock down. So we're going to leave our HTTP GET that returns all of the quotes open, but I'm going to lock down for demonstration purposes the GET method that takes an ID and returns information on just one specific quote. Locking it down here means using the authorize attribute above the method definition, and you can see here when I use this authorize attribute, I'm passing in a string here, can edit quotes, which is obviously associated to the policy we just set up. I'm going to just scroll through the rest of my quotes controller and lock down the other methods, so my post method and also my put method, in addition to my last method here, which is delete. In reality, if we wanted to lock down this entire controller class, we could just add that authorize attribute above the quotes controller declaration. So that's all to it. Let's go ahead and save everything and run the application. But before we do that, let's quickly take a look at our database here, where I'll show you that I have two users set up, Lynn and Wade, and only one of those users, that being Lynn, has the actual claim can edit quotes. So running the application here, what I'm going to do is open up two separate browsers here so we can try things out. In both of these browsers, I'm going to first try to get a list of quotes by accessing the API directly. And you can see that works as expected. We did leave this particular API endpoint open, but now you'll notice if I try to access a specific quote here by maybe going to 3, I need to log in both instances. So let's try 3 on the right, and I'm forced to log in. So now our claims come into play here. If on the left here I log in with a user who does have the claim can edit quotes, I should then hopefully be able to get access to that particular API method. So now that we're logged in, let's try that one more time. API quotes 3, And there you can see we get it. But if on the right here, I log in with a valid user, but maybe that user does not have the correct claim, even though we can get to our Angular application, if we try to access our endpoint that is locked down based on claims, you're going to notice that still does not work out. So we have successfully secured our API not only by authenticated users, but by users who are authenticated and also have the correct claims in place.